Before we begin this sweeping tale of hidden crowns and reluctant hearts, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where my listeners are joining me from around the world. Kindly hit the subscribe button. Now let's get into the story. Duke Alaric Thorne had burned 17 perfumed letters that morning, watching the scented parchment curl and blacken in his study's fireplace. Each one bore a different noble house's seal. Each one contained the same thinly veiled marriage proposal wrapped in wedding congratulations. His younger brother's upcoming nuptials to Princess Seraphina had transformed the sun-drenched citadel into a hunting ground, and Alaric was the prize stag. He stood at the tower window, gazing toward the distant coastline where the sea met the sky in an endless horizon. Out there, people lived without titles weighing on their shoulders, without every word dissected by 100 courtiers. How he envied that freedom! "Your Grace." His aide Marcus entered with cautious footsteps. "You will attend the wedding, I presume?" Alaric's jaw tightened. "I must. But I refuse to walk into that ceremonial circus alone again. Last season's gauntlet of ambitious mothers and their daughters was quite enough." Marcus inclined his head diplomatically. "The imperial court is persistent in their matchmaking efforts." "A charitable description," Alaric muttered. "They circle like vultures over anything they cannot control." He turned from the window. "If I arrive without a companion, the speculation will be unbearable. If I arrive with one of their chosen candidates, I might as well sign my life away at the altar myself." "Do you have someone in mind, Your Grace?" "No," Alaric admitted, the word heavy with frustration. And that is precisely the problem. He wanted no part of the calculated smiles and political maneuvering that passed for courtship among the nobility. They did not want him. They wanted the Thorne influence, the ancient bloodline, the proximity to the throne his brother's marriage would secure. What Alaric longed for was simple honesty. A woman who saw him, not his coronet. Yet the summons remained unyielding. His attendance was not merely expected, it was commanded by blood and duty. 3 days later, while traveling the coastal road to inspect a shipping investment in a seaside village, Alaric's carriage lurched violently and ground to a halt. He stepped out to find the rear axle splintered, the wood cracked clean through from a hidden rut. His driver cursed eloquently and began assessing the damage. 2 hours at least, Your Grace. Maybe 3. Alaric waved him off and turned toward the weathered village nearby. Salt air filled his lungs, a welcome change from perfumed court chambers. The village was simple but lively, fishing boats bobbed in the harbor, nets hung drying on wooden racks, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from a bakery near the docks. As he approached the waterfront, raised voices carried across the weathered planks. "Please, Master Wren. Just 2 more weeks. I swear my sister's wages from the cannery will cover the rest. If promises paid physicians, girl, I'd be living in the capital myself." The apothecary's voice was sharp with exhaustion. "Your sister needs medicine now, not 2 weeks from now. I've extended credit as far as I can." Alaric rounded the corner of a supply shed to find a young woman standing before an elderly apothecary's stall. She wore a simple linen dress, mended carefully at the sleeves, and her dark hair was tied back with a frayed ribbon. But it was her eyes that arrested him, sapphire blue, striking against her sun-warmed skin, holding a depth that seemed at odds with her humble surroundings. Her hands, calloused from labor, were clasped tightly before her, but her spine remained straight as an iron rod. "I know," she said quietly, and Alaric heard no begging in her tone, only a dignity fighting not to shatter. "But without the fever tonic, she won't survive until I can gather the full payment. She's only 12 years old." That is not my burden to carry, the apothecary said, though his voice softened slightly. The young woman's sapphire eyes glistened, but no tears fell. No theatrical collapse, no desperate pleading. Only quiet strength holding itself together by sheer will. Something about her bearing, the way she held her head, the measured control of her voice, reminded Alaric of the way his mother once commanded a room without raising her voice. Alaric stepped forward, almost without conscious decision. "Is there trouble?" The apothecary straightened sharply. "Your Grace. I did not see you approach." Alaric inclined his head toward the woman. "Is this young woman troubling you?" "No, Your Grace." Her voice cut in before the apothecary could respond, clear and surprisingly steady despite the weight on her shoulders. "I only came to ask for an extension on my sister's medicine. I thought it worth trying." Her gaze met his directly, no averting her eyes, no subservient cowering. It was the look of someone accustomed to facing the world on equal terms, nobility or not. The directness of it startled him. Most commoners looked at the ground when he addressed them. This woman looked at him as though she had every right to stand in his presence. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elara Vance, Your Grace." "And your sister is gravely ill?" "Yes." A flicker of vulnerability crossed her features before she mastered it. "Scarlet fever. But we will manage. I always find a way." The apothecary muttered something about hopeless causes and retreated into his shop, leaving them alone in the narrow alley between stalls. Elara exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping just slightly now that the confrontation had ended. She turned to leave. Alaric stepped into her path, not blocking, merely drawing her attention. "Forgive my intrusion, but I overheard enough to understand you carry a burden that should not rest on your shoulders alone." She managed a small, tired smile. "Many families face hardship, Your Grace. Mine is not special." "Your composure is," he said before he could stop himself. She blinked, sapphire eyes widening. "I beg your pardon." "Nothing improper," Alaric assured her quickly. "Merely an observation." He studied her more carefully now, the natural grace in how she stood, the refined bone structure beneath the work-worn exterior, the way her voice carried a musicality that spoke of education she shouldn't possess. "You carry yourself like someone accustomed to better circumstances." A shadow crossed her face, brief but unmistakable. "I work hard, Your Grace. That is all." But it wasn't all. Alaric had spent his entire life reading people at court, and this woman was a mystery wrapped in homespun linen. She had no training in courtly masks and calculated charm, yet she possessed something the nobility spent fortunes trying to cultivate, an effortless dignity that couldn't be bought or taught. An idea formed, audacious and impractical, yet somehow perfectly logical. "Miss Vance," he began carefully. "I must ask you something highly unusual." Her posture tensed slightly. "Unusual in what manner, Your Grace?" "I am expected at my brother's wedding in 2 days' time," Alaric explained. "It will be the grandest celebration the sun-drenched citadel has seen in a generation. Every noble house from the northern mountains to the southern isles will attend. Princess Serafina herself is to become the future empress." She nodded politely, clearly unsure where this was leading. "I would prefer not to appear alone," Alaric continued. "Being the unmarried brother of the groom invites precisely the kind of attention I wish to avoid. I require a companion, someone presentable, composed, and able to maintain grace under scrutiny." He paused, watching her reaction. "Someone like you." Elara stared at him as if he'd begun speaking a foreign language. Me, your grace. Yes. If you agree to accompany me for 3 days, the journey, the wedding, and the celebration after, I will compensate you with enough gold to cover your sister's full medical treatment and provide additional security for your family for the entire year ahead. Perhaps longer. Her mouth opened slightly, stunned into silence. Then reality crashed over her features. I have never even seen the inside of a noble house. I do not know which fork to use, how to curtsy properly, or what topics are appropriate for conversation. I would embarrass you in front of the entire imperial court. I would not make the offer if I believed that, Alaric said softly. In fact, your unfamiliarity with court politics is precisely what makes you perfect for this. I ask only that you remain yourself, honest, composed, graceful. That is more than sufficient. She shook her head, overwhelmed. Why would you choose a stranger from a fishing village? Surely you know dozens of appropriate women. Because strangers do not seek to gain anything beyond what is promised, he answered. Every woman at court wants something from me, title, wealth, influence, access to the throne. You want only to save your sister. That makes you the most honest person I'm likely to meet. He softened his voice. And because you look at the world as though it still contains decency. I cannot recall when I last encountered that quality. Her breath caught, not from flattery, but from the sheer impossibility of what he was offering. She twisted her fingers together, and he saw the war happening behind those striking eyes. Pride fighting necessity. Fear battling hope. My sister's medicine. She whispered. The payment would be immediate. In gold. Enough for the full treatment and more. You would have it before we depart. Elara's eyes closed briefly. When they opened, resolve had settled into those remarkable sapphire depths. Then yes, your grace. I will go with you. Unexpected relief washed through Alaric. He hadn't realized how much he'd wanted her to say yes. Thank you, Miss Vance. We leave at dawn tomorrow. Bring whatever you need, though I'll arrange for appropriate gowns and... I won't pretend to be something I'm not, she interrupted, then caught herself. Forgive me, your grace. I only meant. I'll wear what's required, but I cannot lie about who I am. I'm not asking you to lie, Alaric said. I'm asking you to be exactly who you are. That woman I saw facing down the apothecary with dignity and strength, that's who I need beside me. Her agreement was firm, but he could see the quiet fear beneath it, the understanding that she was stepping into a world that devoured the unprepared. The next morning, she arrived at the village inn where his carriage awaited, carrying a small cloth bag that clearly contained everything she owned. She wore the same linen dress, freshly washed and pressed, with her dark hair braided and pinned in a simple crown around her head. The style should have looked plain, but somehow it only emphasized the elegant line of her neck and the aristocratic set of her features. Alaric had arranged for a trunk of court-appropriate gowns to be loaded, along with jewelry and accessories his mother had left him. But something about Elara's simple attire felt more honest than any silk. He helped her into the carriage, his hand steadying her elbow. She moved with natural grace, stepping up without fumbling despite clearly never having entered such a vehicle before. You need only breathe, Miss Vance. The rest will come naturally. She attempted a smile, though her hands trembled slightly as she settled onto the velvet cushions. I will do my best, your grace. Alaric, he said, settling across from her as the horses began their steady rhythm. When we're alone, you may call me Alaric. The formality will become exhausting. That seems inappropriate, your grace. We're supposed to be courting, he pointed out. It would be stranger if you called me, Your Grace, in intimate moments. A flush colored her cheeks, but she nodded. The village faded behind them, the familiar coastline giving way to inland roads, rolling farmland, and distant manor houses. For several minutes, silence filled the carriage. Elara gazed out the window, watching the landscape transform. Her expression was hard to read, part wonder, part apprehension, part something else he couldn't name. A distant, almost haunted quality, as if the passing scenery triggered memories she couldn't quite grasp. Alaric observed her carefully. Despite her nervousness, she sat with remarkable poise, back straight without being rigid, hands folded gracefully, head held high. Not the posture of someone trained in deportment, but something innate. As if her body remembered lessons her mind had forgotten. You may ask me anything, he offered, breaking the silence. She looked up, seeming to shake off whatever thought had claimed her. Why are you so certain this will serve your purpose at the wedding? Because the court fears what it cannot categorize, Alaric replied. They will not know who you are, what family you represent, or what your presence means. That uncertainty will keep their attention occupied and their schemes temporarily at bay. They'll be too busy trying to identify you to plot my entrapment. And you're not worried I'll say something foolish, she asked quietly. That I'll use the wrong title or spill wine on Princess Seraphina's gown? If you say something honest, it will be more graceful than any of the rehearsed performances the nobles deliver daily. He leaned forward slightly. The court is a theater, Elara. Everyone plays a role. The only truly shocking thing you could do is refuse to perform at all. She laughed softly, the first true sound of ease since they'd met. Somehow I don't think refusing to perform will endear me to anyone. It will endear you to me, he said, then caught himself at the intimacy of the words. That is to say, you need only worry about satisfying our arrangement. The court's opinion is irrelevant. The carriage continued its steady journey, carrying them closer to the sun-drenched citadel. As the sun climbed higher, Alaric found himself explaining the key players she would encounter, his brother Theron, earnest and dutiful, Princess Seraphina, politically brilliant beneath her gracious smile, the High Priestess Morvana, who controlled much of the religious authority, Baroness Vane, whose cruelty was matched only by her social influence. Elara listened intently, asking insightful questions that surprised him. She grasped complex political relationships quickly, seeming to understand instinctively what motivated people. When he mentioned the tensions between the Northern Territories and the Southern Isles, lands that had been in conflict for decades before mysteriously going silent 15 years ago, something flickered in her eyes. Pain, perhaps. Or recognition. What happened to the Southern Isles? She asked quietly. A coup, Alaric said. The royal family was assassinated. The islands fell into chaos, then silence. No one knows who rules there now, or if anyone does. It's become a ghost story the court prefers to forget. He studied her reaction. Why do you ask? No reason. But her hand had moved unconsciously to her collarbone, fingers tracing the edge of her simple dress as if searching for something that should be there but wasn't. It just seems sad. An entire kingdom erased from memory. Before Alaric could pursue the observation, the carriage slowed. They were passing through a small farming hamlet, barely more than a cluster of cottages around a well. An elderly woman carrying a basket of lavender was crossing the road. Her gaze drifted toward the carriage window, casual at first, then locked onto Elara with sudden intensity. The basket slipped from her gnarled fingers, lavender spilling across the dirt road in a purple cascade. Her weathered face went bone white, as if she'd seen a ghost rise from the grave. Alaric noticed the reaction but thought little of it. Perhaps the woman recognized his family crest or was simply startled by the grand carriage. Elara, lost in anxious thoughts about the upcoming ordeal, did not see her at all. The old woman stood frozen as the carriage rolled away, her mouth working soundlessly. Then she turned and hurried toward the hamlet square with urgent, unsteady steps, her voice rising in a cry that carried on the wind. "The Sun Princess! The Sun Princess lives! Someone fetch the elder! She's alive!" But the carriage was already too far away for the words to reach the occupants inside, carrying Duke and Commoner closer to a destiny neither of them could yet imagine, a destiny that would see a bride kneel in the aisle and the lost heir of the Southern Isles finally come home. The sun-drenched citadel rose from the landscape like a golden crown, its spires catching the afternoon light and throwing it back to the heavens. Alaric had seen it 1,000 times, but never had it felt quite so much like a prison as it did now, with Elara sitting across from him in increasingly tense silence. She had stopped asking questions an hour ago. Now she simply stared at the approaching fortress, her face growing paler with each passing mile. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. "It's just a building," Alaric said gently. "Stone and gold, nothing more. A building where I'll be surrounded by people who can destroy me with a single glance," Elara whispered. "Your Grace, Alaric, are you certain this is wise? Perhaps you could say I took ill. That I had to return home. And face the vultures alone." Alaric shook his head. "No. We had an agreement, Miss Vance. But more than that, I find I actually want you there." The honesty of the admission surprised even him. She met his eyes, searching for mockery and finding none. "Why?" "Because every person in that citadel will be performing a role, playing a game, maneuvering for advantage. You're the only honest thing I've encountered in years." He leaned forward. "I won't let them hurt you. You have my word." Before she could respond, the carriage passed through the outer gates. Guards in ceremonial armor snapped to attention, their eyes widening slightly at the sight of the Duke's crest. The wheels clattered over marble cobblestones, and suddenly they were inside the palace grounds, surrounded by manicured gardens and fountains that probably cost more than Elara's entire village. The carriage halted before a sweeping staircase where servants in pristine livery waited. Alaric stepped out first, then turned to help Elara descend. She took his hand, and he felt her trembling despite her composed expression. As her feet touched the marble, she wavered slightly, and he steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "Remember," he murmured. "You belong here as much as anyone." A steward appeared, bowing low. "Your Grace, welcome home. His Highness Prince Theron requests your presence in the Rose Garden immediately. He wishes to introduce you to the princess's ladies-in-waiting before tonight's banquet." "Tell my brother I'll join him within the hour," Alaric replied coolly. "I need to see Miss Vance settled in her chambers first." The steward's gaze flickered to Elara, taking in her simple dress and weathered travel cloak. His expression remained neutral, but Alaric saw the calculation behind it. By tomorrow morning, every servant in the citadel would know the Duke had brought a mysterious woman of unclear station. Perfect. They were escorted through corridors that seemed designed to overwhelm, soaring ceilings painted with mythological scenes, walls lined with priceless tapestries, floors of polished stone that reflected like mirrors. Elara walked beside him with her spine straight and her chin up, but he noticed how her gaze darted to every detail, how her breathing had grown shallow. When they reached the guest wing, the steward opened a door to reveal chambers that were modest by palace standards but still grander than anything Elara had likely ever seen. A four-poster bed dominated the room, draped in silk the color of sapphires. Windows overlooked the gardens, and a door led to a private bathing room with a copper tub. "Your trunks have been delivered, miss," the steward said. "A lady's maid will attend you within the hour to prepare you for tonight's banquet." Elara nodded mutely, and the steward withdrew. The moment the door closed, she turned to Alaric with barely controlled panic. "A banquet? Tonight? You said I'd have time to prepare." "You'll do beautifully," Alaric assured her. "The maid will help with your hair and gown. All you need to do is sit beside me and let the nobles wonder who you are. And when they ask directly, tell them the truth, you're from the coast, and you're here as my guest. Let them draw their own conclusions." He smiled slightly. "The more mysterious you are, the less they'll dare to challenge you directly. Uncertainty breeds caution among courtiers." She laughed, but it was a brittle sound. "You're enjoying this? The idea of shocking them all?" "Perhaps I am," Alaric admitted. "I'm tired of their games, their scheming, their assumption that I exist for their amusement. Bringing you here isn't just about avoiding their matchmaking. It's about reminding them that I make my own choices, regardless of their expectations." Elara studied him for a long moment. "This defiance of yours, it's going to cost me, isn't it? They'll take their displeasure out on the easiest target. Not while I'm standing beside you." His voice hardened with certainty. "I meant what I said, Elara. I won't let them hurt you." Something shifted in her expression, gratitude, perhaps, mixed with a determination he hadn't seen before. She squared her shoulders and lifted her chin in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Then I suppose we'd better give them something worth talking about." Alaric felt an unexpected surge of admiration. This woman who had been mending nets 3 days ago was preparing to walk into the viper's nest of imperial politics with her head held high. Whatever else happened this week, he suspected the court would never forget the mysterious woman the Duke brought to the wedding. And neither would he. 3 days earlier, Alaric had stood in that same coastal village with salt wind in his hair and no particular expectations beyond inspecting a shipping ledger. The broken axle had been an annoyance, nothing more. The village itself was unremarkable: weathered docks, fishing boats bobbing in the harbor, nets spread across wooden racks to dry in the sun. He'd wandered toward the waterfront simply to escape his driver's creative cursing, thinking only of how much time this delay would cost him. Then he'd heard her voice. Not the pleading itself, but the quality of it, steady, measured, with an underlying strength that suggested she was accustomed to bearing weight without breaking. He'd followed the sound to the apothecary's stall more out of curiosity than chivalry, expecting to find some desperate fisherwoman begging for charity. What he found instead was Elara. She stood with her back to him initially, and his first impression was of someone dressed in clothes that had seen too many mendings. Her linen dress was clean but faded, the hem frayed, the sleeves patched at the elbows. Her dark hair was tied back with a ribbon that might once have been blue but had weathered to the color of old parchment. Everything about her appearance spoke of hardship, of a life lived at the margins of survival. Then she turned, and Alaric forgot how to breathe. It wasn't her beauty, though she was striking in an uncommon way: fine bone structure, luminous skin despite the coastal sun, lips that curved naturally into a shape that suggested both strength and gentleness. What arrested him were her eyes. Sapphire blue, bright as polished gemstones, holding depths that seemed utterly at odds with her humble surroundings. They were the eyes of someone who had seen more than mending nets and gutting fish. Eyes that held secrets. But it was more than that. It was the way she held herself. Despite the worn clothing, despite the obvious poverty, despite the humiliation of begging for medicine she couldn't afford, Elara Vance stood like someone who had every right to occupy whatever space she chose. Her spine was straight without being rigid. Her head was held high without arrogance. Her hands, though work-roughened, moved with unconscious grace as she gestured. Alaric had spent his entire life among nobility, and he knew what true aristocratic bearing looked like. It wasn't something that could be taught, not really. Oh, deportment masters could drill in the mechanics of posture and movement, but genuine nobility of presence came from somewhere deeper. From being raised since birth with the absolute certainty that you mattered, that the world should make space for you. This woman, who couldn't afford medicine for her dying sister, possessed that quality in abundance. When she spoke, her voice carried a musicality that suggested education. Not the broad coastal accent he'd expected, but clear, well-modulated speech that would have been equally at home in a palace drawing room. She chose her words carefully, precisely, with none of the crude grammar common among the working poor. "I only came to ask for an extension," she'd said, and even in that moment of defeat, there was dignity in how she phrased it. Not, "Please give me more time," with its undertone of powerlessness, but, "I came to ask," active, intentional, as if she were negotiating between equals. The apothecary had retreated, leaving them alone. Alaric had stepped closer, studying her with the same intensity he usually reserved for evaluating political opponents at court. Up close, the contradictions multiplied. Her dress was poor, but it fit her perfectly, as if tailored despite being obviously homemade. Her hands were calloused, but her fingers were long and elegant, moving with precision rather than the blunt efficiency of someone raised to manual labor. A thin scar traced along her hairline, barely visible, but distinctive, the kind left by something sharp and deliberate, not the random injury of childhood. Most tellingly, when he'd stepped into her path, she'd met his gaze without flinching. Most commoners looked away from nobility, conditioned by a lifetime of deference. Elara had looked at him as if assessing his character, as if deciding whether he was worthy of her trust. It was that quality, that inexplicable certainty that she deserved to be treated as an equal, that made Alaric's audacious plan crystallize. This woman, whoever she truly was beneath the surface of her circumstances, possessed something the court had long ago lost. Authenticity. Genuine presence. The kind of natural authority that couldn't be purchased or performed. When she'd accepted his proposal with that quiet, "Then yes, Your Grace, I will go with you," Alaric had felt relief far beyond the practical solution to his social predicament. He'd felt as if he'd discovered something rare and precious, like finding a diamond in the sand. Now, standing in the palace corridor watching servants whisper about the mysterious woman in simple linen, Alaric wondered if his instincts had been right or dangerously naive. Because the more time he spent with Elara Vance, the more certain he became that she wasn't simply a fisherwoman with unusual grace. She was someone wearing the wrong life, like a queen's gown draped over a scarecrow. And sooner or later, someone at this wedding was going to recognize that the fabric didn't match the frame. The question was whether they'd recognize it before or after Alaric's defiant gambit had already succeeded. The gold coins gleamed in Elara's palm like captured sunlight, more wealth than she'd seen in her entire life. Alaric had counted them out that first evening in the village inn, stacking them on the scarred wooden table between them with careful precision. "Enough for her sister's medicine," he'd said. "Enough for a year's security. Enough to change everything." She'd stared at the gold for a long moment, her calloused fingers hovering over the coins as if afraid they might vanish at her touch. When she finally closed her hand around them, Alaric saw her exhale, a long, shuddering breath that carried the weight of months, perhaps years, of worry. "Thank you," she'd whispered, and he'd heard more than gratitude in those words. He'd heard relief so profound it bordered on pain. Now, the morning after their arrival at the citadel, Alaric sat across from her in a private study while morning light streamed through tall windows. Between them lay a bewildering array of items, multiple forks and spoons of varying sizes, wine glasses in different shapes, folded napkins, and small cards labeled with noble titles. "We have 6 hours until tonight's banquet," Alaric said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I'll teach you what you need to know." Elara studied the array with an expression caught between determination and dread. 6 hours to learn what noblewomen spend their entire lives practicing. You don't need perfection. You need competence. He picked up the outermost fork. Start from the outside and work your way in with each course. That's the only rule that truly matters. She nodded, reaching for the fork, and her hand moved to precisely the correct one without hesitation, her fingers gripping it at exactly the right angle. Alaric blinked. He hadn't told her which fork yet. "Like this?" she asked, and the posture was perfect. Not the awkward grip of someone learning, but the natural ease of long practice. "Yes," he said slowly. "Exactly like that." "Have you dined formally before?" "No." Her answer came too quickly, and a shadow crossed her face. "I mean, I don't think so. It just seemed logical." Logical. Alaric filed that away and moved on. "When you're introduced to someone of higher rank, you curtsy. Not too deep, you're my guest, which gives you borrowed status. Just a slight bend of the knees, head inclined." He demonstrated the male equivalent of a bow. Elara rose from her chair and executed a curtsy that would have satisfied the strictest deportment mistress. The angle was precise, her balance perfect, one foot tucked gracefully behind the other. She held it for exactly the appropriate duration before rising with fluid grace. "How was that?" she asked. Alaric felt a chill run down his spine. "Flawless." "Elara, are you certain you've never received formal instruction?" Her brow furrowed, genuine confusion crossing her features. "I've spent my entire life in that village, mending nets and cleaning fish. Where would I have learned to curtsy?" It was a reasonable question with no reasonable answer. Alaric pushed forward, increasingly unsettled. "When addressing royalty, you'll use Your Highness for the first greeting, then Sir or Madam thereafter. For Princess Serafina, you'll use Your Imperial Highness for the first address, since she's the heir apparent," Elara interrupted. Her eyes widened as the words left her mouth. How did I know that?" "I don't know." Alaric leaned forward, studying her carefully. "Elara, do you remember anything unusual from your childhood? Anything before the village?" She shook her head, but her hand had moved to her temple, fingers pressing against her skin as if trying to push through to buried memories. "Sometimes I have dreams. Marble floors. Golden light through tall windows. A woman singing in a language I don't understand." She dropped her hand, frustrated. "But they're just dreams. Everyone dreams." "Not everyone dreams in palace architecture," Alaric murmured. They continued the lesson, but the pattern repeated itself with unsettling consistency. He would begin to explain a protocol, and Elara would complete it before he finished. How to hold a wine glass, her grip was already correct. How to navigate a formal receiving line, she positioned herself perfectly without being told. The proper way to greet a duchess versus a countess, she knew, though she couldn't explain how. By midday, Alaric had abandoned the pretense of teaching her. Instead, he simply walked her through scenarios, watching in growing amazement as she navigated each one with instinctive grace. It was like watching someone remember a language they'd forgotten they spoke. "You're not learning this," he said finally. "You're remembering it." Elara sat very still, her sapphire eyes distant. "That's impossible. I would remember being taught these things. I would remember servants, tutors, a different life." But her voice wavered with uncertainty. "Unless you were very young when you left that life," Alaric suggested gently. "Young enough that it feels like dream fragments instead of memories." She stood abruptly, moving to the window. Her hands gripped the sill, and he saw her knuckles whiten. Why would someone take a child from a noble house and leave her in a fishing village? Why would they let her believe she was a commoner if she was born to something else? To hide her, Alaric said quietly. To keep her safe from something or someone. Or to steal her from where she belonged. Elara turned to face him, and for the first time since they'd met, he saw fear in her eyes. Real, bone-deep fear. "Alaric, what if bringing me here was a mistake? What if someone recognizes me? What if? Then I'll protect you." He crossed the room, stopping just short of touching her. "Whatever you are, whoever you were, it doesn't change our agreement. You're here as my guest, under my protection. No one will harm you." She searched his face, looking for certainty he wasn't sure he possessed. Finally, she nodded. "Then I suppose we'd better finish this crash course. If I'm going to face the imperial court tonight, I should at least know which fork to use." The joke fell flat, but it was brave, and Alaric respected the effort. They returned to the lesson, both of them carefully ignoring the question that now hung between them like morning mist. Who, exactly, was Elara Vance? And why did she carry the manners of royalty in her bones? The closer they drew to the capital, the worse the headaches became. Elara pressed her fingers against her temples as the carriage rolled through increasingly populated countryside, trying to push back against the pressure building behind her eyes. At first, she dismissed it as nerves, as the natural anxiety of approaching a world she didn't belong to. But this felt different. Wrong. Like something inside her skull was trying to claw its way out. "Are you unwell?" Alaric's voice cut through the fog. He'd been watching her with growing concern for the past hour. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing her hands back into her lap. "Just tired." But she wasn't fine. Every landmark they passed triggered something, a flutter of recognition that vanished the moment she tried to grasp it. A stone bridge spanning a river, hadn't she crossed it before? A grove of ancient oaks, hadn't someone told her their names once? The capital's distant spires catching the afternoon sun, hadn't she seen them from a different angle, closer, with someone's hand in hers? The carriage rounded a bend, and suddenly the road was lined with southern jasmine, white blossoms heavy with perfume. The scent hit Elara like a physical blow. She was 5 years old again, running through a garden where jasmine grew wild along stone walls. A woman's voice called after her, laughing, "Careful, little son. The thorns will catch your dress." The woman had dark hair woven with gold thread, and when she smiled, it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Mother." The word came unbidden, certain, devastating. "Elara?" Alaric's hand was on her shoulder, shaking gently. "Elara, breathe." She gasped, realizing she'd stopped breathing. The garden vanished, leaving only the carriage and Alaric's worried face. "I'm sorry. The jasmine. It reminded me of something." "What did you remember?" "A garden. A woman." She pressed her palms against her eyes. "It felt so real, but it can't be. I've never been here before." Alaric said nothing, but his expression was troubled. He opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small flask. "Drink this. It'll help with the headache." The brandy burned going down, but it did help clear her head slightly. Elara handed back the flask and turned to the window, trying to focus on the present rather than fragments of a past she couldn't have lived. But the visions wouldn't stop. They passed through a village square with a fountain shaped like a leaping dolphin, and suddenly she was 7, throwing copper coins into water while an old man told her it would bring luck. She could feel the coins weight in her palm, hear the splash as they hit the water, see the old man's kind smile. A messenger on horseback galloped past wearing livery of crimson and gold, and Elara's chest tightened with inexplicable dread. Those colors. She knew those colors. They meant danger. They meant fire. The memory hit her with such force that she cried out. Alaric lunged across the carriage, catching her before she fell forward. "What is it? What's wrong?" But Elara couldn't answer because she was somewhere else entirely. Night. Smoke thick enough to choke on. Flames consuming velvet curtains and ancient tapestries. A man in crimson and gold armor, his face obscured by a helmet, reaching for her with hands that meant death. Someone screaming, her mother screaming, and then strong arms lifting her, carrying her through corridors that twisted like a maze. "Run, child. Don't look back. Run." A hidden door in a stone wall, narrow stairs spiraling down into darkness. The smell of sea air mixing with smoke. Hands pushing something cold and heavy into her small fingers. "Keep this hidden. Never let them see it. Promise me." She'd looked down at her palm and seen it, a pendant, heavy gold etched with a crest she couldn't quite make out in the darkness. A sun surrounded by waves, or maybe stars, or maybe Elara. Alaric's voice was sharp now, commanding. "Come back. You're safe. You're here with me." She blinked, and the burning palace vanished. She was in the carriage again, shaking violently, with Alaric's arms around her shoulders. Her cheeks were wet. When had she started crying? "I saw fire," she whispered. "So much fire. And a man trying to kill me. And someone gave me something, a pendant with a crest." Her hand moved unconsciously to her collarbone, fingers searching for something that wasn't there. "I used to have it. I know I did. But it's gone now." Alaric's face had gone pale. "What did the crest look like?" "I don't know. It was dark, and I was so small." She pressed her hands against her face, trying to force the fragments into coherence. "Why can't I remember properly? Why does it feel like my own memories are locked behind a door I can't open?" "Because someone locked them there," Alaric said quietly. "Someone wanted you to forget." "Forget what?" He was silent for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Finally, he asked, "Elara, how old were you when you came to the fishing village?" She frowned, trying to pull up the memory. "I don't know. I've always been there, haven't I?" But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. There was a before, shadowy and terrible, that she'd spent her whole life trying not to remember. "The fire you saw," Alaric said carefully. "Do you remember when it happened?" "No. I was very young. Maybe 7 or 8. She looked up at him. "Why? What does it matter?" Alaric's jaw tightened. "Because 15 years ago, when you would have been about 7 or 8, the royal palace of the Southern Isles burned. The entire royal family was assassinated during a coup. He paused, his eyes never leaving her face. Including a young princess. A girl with dark hair and sapphire eyes. The carriage seemed to tilt around her. No. That's impossible. I can't be. Can't you? His voice was gentle but relentless. A girl who curtsies like a princess, who knows court protocol she's never been taught, who dreams of marble floors and golden light. A girl who remembers jasmine gardens and violent fires and hidden pendants. If I were this princess, someone would have recognized me. Someone would have come for me. But even as she spoke, doubt crept in like smoke under a door. Unless they thought you were dead, Alaric said softly. Unless someone hid you so well that even you forgot who you were. The capital's spires rose before them now, golden in the setting sun. And Alara Vance, who might not be Alara Vance at all, stared at them with the growing certainty that she was riding toward a destiny that had been waiting 15 years for her return. The grand hall of the sun-drenched citadel had been built to intimidate, and it succeeded brilliantly. 3 stories of vaulted ceilings soared overhead, painted with scenes of ancient conquests and divine blessings. Crystal chandeliers caught the evening light and scattered it across walls hung with silk tapestries. At the far end, beneath a canopy of white roses and gold ribbon, sat the high table where Prince Theron and Princess Seraphina would preside over the pre-wedding banquet. And filling every available space between the entrance and that table stood the imperial court, dressed in their finest silks and jewels, already whispering behind gloved hands. Alara stood at the threshold beside Alaric, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She wore one of the gowns he'd commissioned, deep sapphire silk that made her eyes luminous, with silver embroidery at the bodice that caught the light with every breath. Her dark hair had been swept into an elegant arrangement by the lady's maid, with small pearls woven through the braids. She looked, Alaric thought with satisfaction, like she belonged here. Like she'd been born to stand in rooms like this. Which, if his suspicions were correct, she had been. Ready, he murmured. She lifted her chin, and something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening of her spine, a settling of her shoulders that transformed her from nervous guest to regal presence. I'm ready. The herald's voice rang out. His Grace, Duke Alaric Thorne, and Miss Alara Vance of the coastal territories. The whispers erupted immediately. Coastal territories, that vague designation could mean anything from minor gentry to common fishwife. The ambiguity was intentional, and it worked exactly as Alaric had hoped. Confusion rippled through the assembled nobles like wind through wheat. They descended the shallow stairs into the hall, and the sea of courtiers parted before them. Alara's hand remained steady on Alaric's arm, her pace measured and unhurried. She didn't look around nervously or shrink from the stairs. Instead, she moved as if she'd walked through rooms like this 1,000 times before, her gaze straight ahead, serene and untouchable. Is that a fishwife? Someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. Baroness Vane, of course, her sharp face twisted with barely concealed contempt. How delightfully rustic of the Duke. Alara's step didn't falter. She turned her head slightly toward the Baroness and offered a small, polite smile, the kind that acknowledged the insult without dignifying it with a response. The Baroness's face flushed. She moves like she's wearing a crown, another voice murmured, this one confused rather than cruel. Lady Ashford, an older woman known for her keen observations. Look at her posture. That's not imitation. That's training. They reached a cluster of younger nobles who had positioned themselves strategically to force any newcomers to navigate around them. It was a subtle power play, a way of demonstrating that they controlled the space. Elara paused, and for a heartbeat Alaric thought she might falter. Instead, she simply waited, her expression perfectly pleasant, until the silence grew uncomfortable. One by one, the nobles shifted aside, suddenly uncertain. Something about her stillness commanded it, not aggression, not demanding, just an absolute certainty that the path would open because of course it would. Extraordinary, Alaric heard someone whisper. They continued toward the high table where Prince Theron rose to greet them. He was younger than Alaric by 3 years, with their father's broad shoulders and their mother's kind eyes. Beside him, Princess Seraphina remained seated. Protocol dictated she need not stand for anyone below royal rank. "Brother," Theron said warmly, embracing Alaric. "We'd nearly given up hope you'd come." "I wouldn't miss your wedding," Alaric replied. "May I present Miss Elara Vance?" "Miss Vance, my brother, Prince Theron, and his betrothed, Her Imperial Highness Princess Seraphina." Elara executed a perfect curtsy, not too deep, acknowledging their rank while maintaining her own dignity as Alaric's guest. "Your Highness. Your Imperial Highness. Congratulations on your upcoming nuptials." Theron smiled, already charmed. But Seraphina's reaction was different. The princess had started to extend her hand in a polite but distant manner she showed to all minor guests. Then her gaze met Elara's, and something flickered across her face. Surprise. Recognition. Her hand froze mid-gesture. "Miss Vance," Seraphina said slowly, her voice careful. "Welcome to the Citadel. Tell me, have we met before? Your face seems familiar." "I don't believe so, Your Imperial Highness," Elara replied, but Alaric felt her hand tighten imperceptibly on his arm. "This is my first time at court." Seraphina's eyes narrowed slightly, studying Elara with an intensity that made the moment stretch uncomfortably. Finally, she nodded. "Perhaps you simply have one of those faces. Please, enjoy the banquet." They were dismissed, guided to seats further down the high table. As they settled into their chairs, Alaric leaned close to Elara. She recognized something. "I know." Elara's voice was barely audible. "When she looked at me, I felt. I don't know. Like I should know her. Like we've met in a dream." Around them, the court continued to whisper. But the tone had shifted. The initial mockery had given way to uncertainty. This mysterious woman didn't behave like a commoner trying to ape her betters. She behaved like someone who had momentarily misplaced her crown and was graciously tolerating its absence. By the time the first course arrived, half the room was watching Elara more closely than they watched the royal couple. She handled each utensil with unconscious precision, engaged in conversation with perfect courtesy when addressed, and otherwise maintained a serene composure that suggested she found the entire affair pleasantly routine rather than overwhelming. "She's magnificent," Lady Ashford announced loudly to her companions. "I don't care if she's from the coastal territories or the moon. That girl has breeding." Baroness Vane's expression had progressed from contempt to confusion to something approaching alarm. She leaned toward the High Priestess Morvanna, whispering urgently, but the priestess simply watched Elara with hooded eyes, her expression unreadable. Alaric allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd brought Elara here to shield himself from the court's machinations, to throw them off balance with uncertainty. But she'd done something far more effective. She'd walked into their territory and claimed it as her own, not through aggression or pretension, but through the simple, undeniable rightness of her presence. She belonged here. And despite their cruelty, despite their mockery, the court was beginning to sense it. They just didn't know why yet. But they would. Very soon, they would. Chapter 6, The Night of Whispers. The masquerade ball on the second evening transformed the citadel into something from a fever dream. Masks glittered under candlelight, some elegant, some grotesque, all designed to obscure and intrigue. Musicians played from a hidden gallery, their melody weaving through conversations and laughter. Couples danced across the marble floor in swirls of silk and velvet, their identities concealed behind feathers and jewels and painted leather. Alaric stood at the edge of the ballroom, a simple black mask covering the upper half of his face, and searched the crowd for Elara. He'd lost sight of her 20 minutes ago when Lady Ashford had swept her away for introductions, and the sea of masked faces made finding anyone nearly impossible. Then he saw her. She wore a gown of midnight blue that seemed to capture starlight, and her mask was silver filigree shaped like wings, leaving her lips and chin exposed. Her dark hair was pinned with crystal drops that caught the light with every movement. She stood near the terrace doors, speaking with someone he didn't recognize, a man in a crimson mask who leaned too close, too familiar. Alaric moved through the crowd without conscious thought, some primal instinct driving him forward. By the time he reached her side, the man had vanished into the press of bodies. "There you are," Elara said, and her smile was genuine relief. "I was beginning to think I'd been abandoned to the wolves." "Never." The word came out more intense than he'd intended. "Are you all right?" That man was persistent but harmless. She touched his arm lightly. "You don't need to protect me from every nobleman who asks me to dance, Alaric. I can manage a few unwanted advances." But it wasn't about managing advances. It was about the way his chest had tightened when he'd seen another man standing so close to her. The way jealousy had flared hot and immediate, foreign and unsettling. When had she stopped being merely his convenient shield and become something else entirely? "Dance with me," he said, offering his hand. Her eyebrows rose above the silver mask. "Is that a request or a command, Your Grace?" "A plea." He softened his voice. "Please. Before someone else claims you." She placed her hand in his, and he led her onto the floor as a waltz began. His hand settled at her waist, hers rested on his shoulder, and they began to move. She followed his lead effortlessly, as if they'd danced together 100 times before. "You're full of surprises," Alaric murmured. "Let me guess, you learned to waltz while mending fishing nets." "Perhaps I'm just naturally graceful," she replied, but her smile was uncertain. "Or perhaps I'm remembering something else I shouldn't know how to do." They turned, and the ballroom blurred around them. In this moment, behind their masks, they could be anyone. Not a duke and a commoner. Not a protector and his charge. Just two people moving together in perfect synchronization. "I owe you an apology," Alaric said quietly. "For what?" "For bringing you here under false pretenses. I told myself I needed a shield from the court's matchmaking, and that was true. But I also wanted to shake them up, to prove I could defy their expectations." He met her eyes through the masks. "I didn't expect to care what happened to you beyond our arrangement. I didn't expect to want to know everything about you, your thoughts, your fears, your dreams. I didn't expect you." Elara's breath caught, but she didn't look away. "You hired me to play a role, Alaric. Nothing more. I know what I hired you to do. But what I'm feeling now has nothing to do with our contract." His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Somewhere between the fishing village and tonight, you stopped being a convenient solution and became someone I can't stop thinking about. Someone I don't want to let go when this is over." "Don't." Her voice was barely audible over the music. Don't say things like that. In 3 days, I'll return to my village, and you'll remain here with your title and your responsibilities. Whatever this is, it can't be real. It's the masks and the music and the pretense. Is it? He pulled her slightly closer as they turned. Because I've never felt more honest in my life than I do right now, dancing with a woman who might be a lost princess, might be a fisherman's daughter, but is definitely the most extraordinary person I've ever met. Tears gleamed in her eyes above the silver mask. You don't know me, Alaric. I don't even know myself. How can you claim to feel something real for someone who doesn't exist? You exist. His voice was fierce with certainty. Whatever name you were born with, whatever life was stolen from you, the woman in my arms right now is real. The way you face cruelty with grace is real. The way you worry about your sister is real. The way you make me want to be better than I am is real. The music swelled toward its conclusion, and other dancers pressed closer around them. But in that moment, Alaric was aware only of Alara, the way her hand trembled in his, the way her eyes searched his face as if trying to find truth in his words, the way she fit against him as if they'd been designed for each other. What happens when the ball ends? She whispered. When the masks come off and we have to face who we really are. Then we face it together. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her gloved fingers. Whatever comes next, whatever you discover about your past, whatever the court tries to do to us, we face it together. The music ended. Around them, couples broke apart, applauding the musicians. But Alaric and Alara remained still, hands joined, the space between them charged with something that felt like a promise neither had intended to make. From across the ballroom, High Priestess Morvana watched them with calculating eyes. And beside her, Baroness Vane whispered urgently into her ear, gesturing toward Alara with barely concealed agitation. Whatever game they'd been playing by bringing Alara here, Alaric realized, had just become infinitely more complicated. Because he'd done the one thing he'd sworn he wouldn't do. He'd fallen in love with her. And in the glittering, treacherous world of the imperial court, love was the most dangerous weapon anyone could wield. Chapter 7. The masks came off at midnight. It was tradition, Alaric explained as servants circulated with silver trays to collect the discarded disguises. The final hour of the masquerade was meant to be unmasked, a symbolic gesture of trust and transparency before the sacred wedding ceremony. Alara watched nobles around her reveal their faces with theatrical flourishes, laughing as they discovered who they'd been dancing with, who they'd been gossiping to. Her fingers moved to the ribbons of her silver mask, then hesitated. Something about removing it felt dangerous, though she couldn't articulate why. As if the mask had been protecting her from more than mere recognition. It's all right, Alaric murmured beside her. You're beautiful with or without it. She pulled the ribbons loose, and the silver filigree fell away into her hands. The cool air touched her face, and she felt suddenly, terribly exposed. Across the ballroom, Princess Serafina was accepting her future husband's hand for the final dance of the evening. Prince Theron led her onto the floor as the musicians began a slow, elegant waltz. The princess's mask had already been removed, revealing her composed features and the small circlet of diamonds resting in her elaborately styled hair. They turned, and Serafina's gaze drifted across the crowd with the practiced disinterest of someone who had attended 1,000 such gatherings. Then her eyes landed on Alara. The princess stopped moving. Prince Theron stumbled slightly at the sudden halt, confusion crossing his face. Serafina. Are you unwell? But Serafina wasn't listening. Her hand had risen to her throat, fingers pressing against her collarbone as if trying to steady her breathing. Her face had gone pale beneath the candlelight, her eyes fixed on Alara with an intensity that made everyone nearby turn to see what had captured her attention. Alara felt her chest tighten. The princess was staring at something specific, not her face as a whole, but a small point just below her left ear. Without thinking, Alara's own hand moved to the spot, fingers finding the small mark she'd always had there. A birthmark, she'd thought, shaped vaguely like a crescent moon or perhaps a breaking wave. She'd never thought much about it. Just another unremarkable feature of an unremarkable life. But Serafina was staring at it as if she'd seen a ghost rise from the grave. The music faltered. The musicians, sensing something wrong, let the melody trail into silence. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath as Princess Serafina walked toward Alara with slow, measured steps that somehow felt like they covered an impossible distance. "Your Imperial Highness," Alaric began, but Serafina raised a hand, silencing him without ever taking her eyes off Alara. She stopped directly in front of Alara, close enough that Alara could see tears gathering in her eyes. The princess's hand reached out, trembling, and her fingers hovered just above Alara's birthmark without quite touching. "The sunburst mark," Serafina whispered, her voice breaking. "The birthmark carried by every daughter of the Southern Isles royal bloodline for 300 years. Her voice rose, carrying across the silent ballroom. "My mother told me about it. She made me memorize every detail of the young princess who was her goddaughter. Made me promise to watch for her, to remember her, should she ever return." Alara couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. Couldn't process what was happening. And then Princess Serafina, heir to the imperial throne, betrothed of Prince Theron, did something no one in the room could have anticipated. She sank to her knees on the marble floor. "Your Majesty," Serafina said clearly, her voice ringing through the shocked silence. "Princess Solara of the Southern Isles. The Sunborn. The lost heir." She bowed her head. "Welcome home." The wedding ceremony began under a sky so clear it seemed scrubbed clean by divine hands. White roses cascaded from every column of the grand cathedral, their perfume thick enough to taste. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting the assembled nobility in jeweled colors as they waited for Princess Serafina to make her processional entrance. Alara sat in the third row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Since last night's revelation, she'd barely slept. Palace physicians had been summoned to examine her birthmark. Ancient texts had been retrieved from the royal archives. 3 separate witnesses who'd served in the Southern Isles before the coup had been brought to identify her through tears and trembling hands. By dawn, there was no doubt remaining. She was Princess Solara. The lost heir. The girl everyone had believed died 15 years ago in flames and blood. Alaric sat beside her, his hand finding hers beneath the folds of her gown. She gripped it like a lifeline. "Breathe," he murmured. "Whatever happens today, I'm here." But she could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes on her. Word had spread through the citadel like wildfire. The mysterious woman the Duke brought to the wedding was royalty. Lost royalty. Stolen royalty. The whispers had grown into shouts, speculation into certainty, and now the entire court was watching to see what would happen when Princess Serafina walked down that aisle. The processional music began. The congregation rose as one. Serafina appeared at the cathedral entrance, resplendent in cloth of gold and diamonds. But she wasn't looking at her waiting groom. Her gaze swept the assembled crowd until it found Alara, and something passed between them, an understanding, a confirmation, a choice being made in real time. She began her walk down the aisle with measured steps, her train flowing behind her like a river of light. Prince Theron stood at the altar, pride and joy evident on his face. The high priestess Morvanna waited beside him, her expression carefully neutral despite the chaos that had engulfed the court overnight. Serafina reached the halfway point. Then she stopped. The music faltered. Confused murmurs rippled through the cathedral. Prince Theron stepped forward, concern creasing his brow. Serafina. But the princess wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Baroness Vane, who sat in the front row with High Priestess Morvanna's most trusted advisors. The Baroness's face had gone rigid, her fingers white-knuckled on her prayer book. "Before I take these vows," Serafina's voice rang clear through the cathedral, "I must speak truth that has been buried too long." She turned to face the congregation. 15 years ago, the royal family of the Southern Isles was murdered in a coup that many believed was random violence, born of civil unrest. "Your Imperial Highness," Morvanna said sharply. "This is hardly the time." "It was not random." Serafina spoke over her. "It was orchestrated by members of this very court. Nobles who feared the Southern Isles' growing influence, who wanted their resources and their shipping routes, who saw opportunity in chaos." Her gaze locked on Baroness Vane. "Nobles who paid assassins in crimson and gold to murder a family and steal a kingdom." The cathedral erupted. Shouts of denial, gasps of shock, the scraping of benches as people rose in confusion. Guards moved toward the exits, blocking them. Prince Theron stood frozen, comprehension dawning on his face. And Alara understood. This was why Serafina had recognized her so immediately. Not just from her birthmark, but because Serafina had been watching, waiting, knowing that if the lost heir survived, her return would force the conspirators into the light. Baroness Vane stood abruptly. "This is absurd. You have no proof of these wild accusations." "I have the princess herself." Serafina turned and walked directly to where Alara sat, trembling. "Stand, Your Majesty. Let them see what they tried to destroy." Alaric's hand tightened on Alara's. She rose on unsteady legs, and Serafina took her hand, drawing her forward into the aisle. Into the light. Into view of everyone who had dismissed her, mocked her, underestimated her. Then Princess Serafina, heir to the imperial throne, dropped to one knee before her. "All debts must be paid," Serafina said clearly. "All wrongs must be answered. The Southern Isles demand their queen." The Southern Isles had waited 15 years for their queen, and they welcomed her home with a fervor that bordered on religious ecstasy. Alara stood at the bow of the royal ship as it approached the main harbor, watching the coastline materialize through morning mist. She'd left these islands as a terrified child fleeing through smoke and darkness. She returned as Queen Solara, though the name still felt like an ill-fitting gown she was learning to wear. Behind her, Alaric's presence was a steady warmth. He'd insisted on accompanying her despite the political complications it created. A foreign duke courting a newly restored queen raised eyebrows in both courts, but neither of them cared. They'd already weathered worse than diplomatic gossip. The harbor was packed with people. Thousands of them, holding flowers and ribbons in the gold and azure colors of the Southern Isles. When they caught sight of her, the roar that went up was deafening. She saw tears streaming down weathered faces, saw elderly men and women dropping to their knees, saw children being lifted onto shoulders to glimpse the lost princess who'd returned from the dead. "They love you," Alaric murmured. "They've never stopped loving you." Her throat tightened. "They love a memory. I'm not the princess they lost." "No." His hand found hers. "You're the queen they need." The transition had been swift once the truth came out. Baroness Vane and 3 other conspirators had been arrested, their decades-long plot to keep the Southern Isles in chaos finally exposed. High Priestess Morvanna, while not directly involved in the assassination, had been complicit in suppressing evidence of Alara's survival. She'd been removed from her position, her influence shattered. Prince Theron and Princess Seraphina's wedding had been postponed, though they both insisted it was temporary. "We'll marry when proper celebration can occur," Seraphina had told Alara privately. "When you're seated on your rightful throne and the world is right again." The ship docked, and Alara descended the gangplank to thunderous cheers. Local nobles waited to greet her, many of them survivors of her father's court. They knelt as she passed, their faces wet with tears. An elderly woman pressed forward through the crowd, held back gently by guards until Alara gestured for her to approach. "Your Majesty," the woman sobbed. "I served your mother. I held you as a babe. When I saw you in the Duke's carriage, I thought I'd gone mad, but I knew. I knew you lived." Alara embraced her, this stranger who'd recognized her when she hadn't even recognized herself. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for remembering." The coronation took place 3 days later in the rebuilt palace, its marble floors scrubbed clean of the blood and ash that had soaked them 15 years prior. Alara wore her mother's crown, recovered from the royal vault where it had waited in darkness. The gold was heavy, the sapphires cold against her forehead, but when she looked out at the assembled court and saw hope rekindled in their faces, the weight felt purposeful rather than burdensome. Her first act as queen was to dispatch funds and physicians to the coastal village that had sheltered her. Her sister, the girl she'd believed was her sister, who'd loved her despite having no blood claim, would receive the finest medical care available. The villagers who protected a lost princess without knowing it would be rewarded for their kindness. "You don't have to repay them," Alaric said that evening as they walked through the palace gardens where jasmine grew wild. "They helped you because they're good people." "I know." She touched the white blossoms, breathing in their perfume as memories, real memories now, not fragments, stirred. "But I can still honor that goodness. A queen who forgets where she came from is no queen at all." He stopped walking, turning to face her in the fading light. "And what about a duke who loves a queen? Where does he fit in this new world you're building?" Her breath caught. He'd been careful not to press her, not to add his own desires to the mountain of expectations and responsibilities suddenly crushing down on her shoulders. But she saw the question in his eyes, the hope he was trying to hide. "I think," she said slowly, "that a queen who bridged 2 worlds might need a consort who understands both nobility and the simple worth of honest hearts." She stepped closer. "I think she might need someone who saw her worth when she was nobody, who protected her when she was vulnerable, who loved her before she wore a crown." "Loved," he echoed. Present tense. "Loves," she corrected. Present and future. "If he'll have a queen who's still learning how to be royal, who sometimes forgets which fork to use, who dreams of fishing villages and marble palaces in equal measure." Alaric's laugh was warm and genuine. "I think he'd consider himself the luckiest man in both kingdoms." He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "2 crowns, then. Yours and eventually mine when my brother takes the throne. We'll need 2 palaces, 2 courts, endless diplomatic complications. And 1 love," Alara finished. "To make it all worthwhile." When he kissed her, the jasmine released its perfume into the evening air, and somewhere in the rebuilt palace, a mother's portrait smiled down on the daughter she'd saved. The lost princess had found her way home at last, and she'd brought her heart with her. The Southern Isles had their queen. And the queen, against all odds and despite every obstacle, had found her king.
Thank you so much for watching. Your support truly means everything to me. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It only takes a second but helps immensely in bringing you more content like this. I've got another compelling video ready for you. Just click on it now to continue. See you in the next one.